Hi, I'm Megan. I found out my husband had two children with my own sister in the middle of a 4th of July cookout, standing by the drinks table, holding a paper plate of coleslaw, while 40 people I love watched my face change in real time. Nobody told me first, nobody pulled me aside into the kitchen or the garage to soften it. I found out in public out loud in front of casserole dishes and lawn chairs because everybody else already knew and simply assumed I did too. That's the injustice I actually want to talk about tonight, not just the affair itself, because affairs happen, people are weak. That part is almost boring at this point. What broke something in me was realizing how many people had been quietly protecting that lie for months, maybe longer, while I kept writing checks, paying bills, and holding this entire family together the way I always had, without a single one of them thinking I deserved to know the truth first. Have you ever found out something devastating not from the person who did it, but from a total stranger who assumed it was common knowledge? Tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every single comment, and if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it genuinely helps me keep telling stories like this one, because stories like mine deserve to be heard all the way to the end, not scrolled past halfway through. My name is Megan Whitfield. Well, it was Whitfield before I married into the Sullivan family 9 years ago, and for most of those 9 years I was the responsible one, not just in my marriage, in my entire family since I was a little girl. I was the oldest daughter, the one who learned to balance a checkbook at 14 because my parents genuinely couldn't. The one who called the electric company in a shaking voice when the lights got shut off during my junior year of high school. The one who never once got to fall apart in front of anyone because somebody had to keep the actual lights on, literally, not metaphorically. My younger sister Ashley was the opposite of all of that. In almost every visible way, she was the pretty one, the delicate one, the one everybody rushed toward the second her voice wobbled even slightly at a family dinner. I never resented her out loud for it, not once. I just quietly absorbed the lesson underneath it, that some people in this world get held, and some people get handed the bills. And I had apparently been sorted into the second category before I was even old enough to understand what sorting meant. When I met David Sullivan at 26, at a mutual friend's engagement party in Charlotte, I genuinely thought I'd finally found somewhere I could put all that hard-earned responsibility to good use, instead of just surviving on it quietly, alone. His family ran a property management company, Sullivan Property Group, a handful of modest rental buildings scattered around the city, and one very valuable duplex near Myers Park that had stayed in the family for 3 generations. Passed down like a strange kind of heirloom. Nobody quite knew how to talk about at dinner. I'm an accountant by training, and within a year of marrying David, I was quietly doing the books for the entire company, informally at first. Favors between family, then officially, on a salary that was frankly beneath what I could have earned doing identical work for a total stranger downtown. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. I told myself it was family, it was building something lasting, it was ours, every spreadsheet, every tax filing, every late night at the kitchen table with a calculator. David's mother, Diane, took to me in a strange, quiet, almost wary way from the very first Thanksgiving I spent at that house, long before David and I were even officially engaged. She wasn't a warm woman in any traditional sense. She didn't hug easily or say, "I love you," the way my own mother did. But she started handing me things, small physical objects that felt oddly significant even then. The key to the safe deposit box at the bank downtown, the manila folder with the original deed to the duplex, yellowed at the corners, the login credentials to the LLC's business bank account, written on a slip of paper she pressed into my palm like it was fragile. She never once explained why she trusted me with the actual paperwork more than she trusted her own son, and honestly, at the time, young and eager to belong somewhere, I took it as a compliment and didn't ask too many questions I probably should have asked. Looking back now, with everything I know, I think some quiet part of her already suspected something about David that the rest of us hadn't figured out yet, and maybe wouldn't for years. For the first several years, everything looked completely fine from the outside, the way a house looks fine, right up until the foundation cracks underneath it where nobody's checking. David and I hosted every holiday, every Sunday dinner, every birthday. Ashley came over almost every single Sunday, because she said she hated eating alone in her apartment, and I never thought twice about it because that was just who Ashley had always been, the one who needed a soft place to land while she figured her life out at her own unhurried pace. I'd cook, usually something too elaborate for a Tuesday. David would open a bottle of wine he was proud of, and Ashley would curl up on our couch with her bare feet tucked underneath her, exactly like she had since we were girls, sharing a bedroom. I actually liked having her there most nights. I told myself I was being a good sister, generous, patient, giving her the stability nobody had really given either of us growing up. I had absolutely no idea I was quietly handing her a front row seat to the slow unraveling of my own marriage. The signs, if I'm being completely honest with you tonight, were there for a long time before that cookout ever happened, scattered like breadcrumbs I chose not to follow. David started working late, more often, some months 3 or 4 nights a week, though the company's own billable hours never once reflected any extra work to match the excuse. Ashley started dressing differently on the night she knew David would be around. Small, deliberate things, a new perfume that lingered on our couch cushions, a dress she would never have worn to an ordinary family dinner 2 years earlier. I noticed all of it. I want to be very clear about that because so many people ask me afterward how I possibly could not have known. I noticed, and then I did exactly what I had always done with uncomfortable things in this family since I was a child. I filed it away quietly and kept moving forward because somebody had to keep this family's engine running smoothly, and it had always, without exception, been me. The last piece before the cookout arrived as a hospital billing email that landed in my inbox purely by administrative mistake, because I managed the family's shared insurance account for tax and reimbursement purposes. It was a maternity claim, itemized delivery charges, 2 separate infant patient identification numbers, and a name typed into the insured relationship field that made my stomach drop several seconds before my brain even fully caught up with what my eyes were reading. I remember sitting alone at my kitchen table at 11 at night, reading that email 4 separate times, telling myself there had to be some reasonable explanation, a clerical mix-up somewhere in the billing department, anything at all other than the obvious ugly thing quietly staring back at me in plain 12-point font on a screen I couldn't stop looking at. I didn't say a single word to David that night. I didn't say anything to Ashley either, though I thought about calling her at least 3 times with my thumb hovering over her name. I just closed my laptop very slowly, went to bed beside my husband, like it was any other Tuesday, and lay there for hours in the dark, listening to him breathe evenly beside me, running numbers in my head the way I always did when I was frightened and needed something to hold on to. Except this time, the numbers weren't rent rolls or tax deductions or depreciation schedules. They were about my entire adult life, 9 years of it, and whether any of it had ever actually been real or whether I'd simply been funding, quietly and faithfully, a very long and very expensive lie the whole time without ever once being asked to sign off on it. Growing up, whenever something went visibly wrong in our house, my parents' very first instinct was always to check on Ashley before anyone even thought to ask whether I was all right. I broke my wrist falling off my bike when I was 12 years old, out on the gravel by the mailbox, and I remember lying flat on the ground in real pain while my mother's first sentence out loud, shouted across the yard, was, "Ashley, honey, don't look, go back inside. Not someone please call an ambulance for your other daughter." The ambulance did eventually get called. My wrist did eventually get set in a cast. I signed myself 2 weeks later, but that exact pattern never once changed as we both grew older. It simply got quieter, better dressed, and considerably more expensive to maintain. By the time I turned 30, that same childhood pattern had fully migrated into my marriage without me ever really noticing the transfer happening in real time. If Ashley needed her car payment covered for a month, David and I covered it without a single follow-up question, because she's going through a rough patch right now, as if rough patches weren't something the rest of us were also quietly living through. If I needed anything, even something small, a new coat, a weekend away, I usually just didn't ask at all because I'd learned a long time ago that asking made you a burden, and being endlessly useful was the only currency I fully trusted myself to spend without fear of being resented for it. I told myself repeatedly that this was simply maturity. Some nights, lying awake beside David long after he'd fallen asleep, it felt a lot less like maturity and a lot more like exhaustion, wearing a nicer, more socially acceptable word. The Sullivan Property Group grew steadily under my books during those years, quarter after quarter, and I want to be specific about the actual numbers here because they matter enormously later in this story. The duplex near Myers Park alone was worth close to $3 million by our 5th year of marriage, generating steady, reliable rental income every single month, income that I personally tracked, filed, and protected the way some people protect a child. David's official title on paper was managing partner. My title was bookkeeper on a salary of $54,000 a year, less than half of what I could have billed doing identical work for a stranger's company across town, a fact David's own accountant once mentioned to me quietly at a Christmas party, like it was a compliment instead of a warning. There was one evening, maybe 2 years into the marriage, when Diane and I were alone in her kitchen drying dishes after a family dinner, and she paused with a plate half dried in her hands and said, almost to herself, "You remind me of myself at your age, Megan, before I learned to stop trusting my own judgment about people I loved." I asked her what she meant, genuinely curious, and she just shook her head slightly and said, "Never mind, some things aren't mine to say yet," and went back to drying the plate like the moment hadn't happened at all. I thought about that sentence for weeks afterward, turning it over, and I never once thought to connect it to David directly, because what kind of mother says something like that about her own son without ever finishing the thought out loud? I used to joke with David half seriously that I was married to the business at least as much as I was married to him, and he'd laugh easily and say that just made me irreplaceable, which at the time genuinely felt like a compliment worth holding on to. Diane never once laughed at that particular joke. She'd just look at me over the top of her reading glasses with this strange, careful, appraising expression, like she was quietly watching something whose ending she already understood better than I did. Around that same time, she started asking me, more and more frequently, to keep certain files somewhere separate from the office, a small fireproof box in my own home study instead of the shared filing cabinet at the company that David and his employees used every single day without a second thought. I remember one specific Thursday night, 3 years into the marriage, when I stayed up past 1 in the morning at the kitchen table, finishing the company's quarterly filings by myself, calculator glowing, coffee gone cold beside a stack of receipts, while David and Ashley sat out on the back porch laughing at something on his phone. The sliding door cracked just enough that the sound drifted in every few minutes. I told myself I didn't mind, that somebody had to get the numbers right before the filing deadline, that this was simply what being useful looked like in a family like ours. I finished around 2, quietly filed the folder in its labeled place, and went to bed alone, and neither of them ever once asked what had kept me up so late, or seemed to notice I hadn't been sitting out there with them at all. Ashley, meanwhile, drifted between jobs the way some people drift between rented apartments, never quite settling, a receptionist position here for 8 months, a part-time yoga studio gig there for a season, always gently framed by the whole family, as still finding herself well into her early 30s. Nobody ever once asked Ashley to find herself any faster. Nobody ever handed Ashley a $54,000 salary and told her to simply be grateful for the valuable exposure it offered. I quietly paid her car insurance for an entire year once, routed through an account David never checked because she'd begged me not to tell him she'd let the policy lapse, and I remember feeling genuinely proud of myself afterward for helping her without ever making her feel small or exposed about needing it. Looking back now, with everything I eventually learned, I think that's precisely the kind of instinct she and David were quietly counting on the entire time, my deeply ingrained habit of protecting people gently, instead of ever asking the hard, uncomfortable questions loudly and in public. I was this family's shock absorber, in every sense of that word. Bills got paid before anyone had the chance to panic. Arguments got smoothed over calmly before they could become real fights with real consequences. Secrets, apparently, got kept safely tucked away too, just not the kind of secrets I ever imagined I was helping to keep. I still wonder, some nights, how many Sunday dinners I personally hosted in my own dining room, pouring good wine for 2 people who were already quietly living an entire other life underneath the one I could actually see with my own eyes. I think about a specific dinner, maybe 4 months before the cookout. When Ashley showed up unannounced with a bottle of wine she said was to thank us both for always being there for her, and David poured 3 glasses without a word. And the two of them fell into an easy, private kind of laughter over some story I hadn't been part of. Something about a weekend trip Ashley had taken that I didn't remember hearing about at all. I asked lightly when that trip had been, and there was a half-second pause before Ashley said, "Last month, sometime," you know how it blurs together, and changed the subject to my cooking instead. I let it go. I always let it go. I poured myself more wine and told myself I was imagining the pause because the alternative was too large a thing to hold at a dinner table on a random Tuesday. There is a very specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by your own family, people who share your blood and your holidays and your childhood photographs, and still feeling like the only person in the room who doesn't know the real rules of the game everyone else is quietly playing. I started feeling that particular loneliness in small, almost unplaceable moments. A look between David and Ashley across the dinner table that lasted half a second too long to be nothing. A laugh that felt somehow aimed at a joke I wasn't standing close enough to hear. I never had any actual proof of anything back then, just a low, persistent hum of wrongness underneath everything that I kept quietly talking myself out of. Because the alternative meant blowing up an entire life I had built with my own 2 hands, receipt by receipt, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, year after patient year. I want to say something directly here for anyone listening tonight who has ever felt that hum and chosen to ignore it anyway, the way I did. I ignored mine for the same reason most of us do. And it isn't because I was naive or foolish, it's because I was tired, bone deep tired, and being the responsible one for so many years quietly teaches you to distrust your own instincts in favor of whatever keeps the surface of things calm. I had spent an entire decade being the person who fixed things quietly, without fanfare, without complaint. It never once genuinely occurred to me that the thing most urgently in need of fixing was sitting directly across my own dinner table, night after night, smiling warmly at me, calmly asking for a second helping. If you're the one who always holds things together in your own family, the one everyone calls first when a bill is overdue or a genuine crisis hits at 2 in the morning, I need you to hear this next part clearly because it took me the better part of a decade to learn it myself. The hard way, being needed by people is not the same thing as being valued by them, and being trusted with the paperwork of a family is not remotely the same thing as being told the actual, complete truth. I was about to learn that painful lesson in the most public, most humiliating way imaginable, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in July, standing in Diane's own backyard, holding a burger in one hand and watching my entire carefully built life quietly split open in the other. The cookout was Diane's idea, exactly like it was every single year without fail, held at the family's modest lake house on Lake Norman, the one place David's late father used to say made every property headache and every tax season completely worth it. 40-some people were there that afternoon. Cousins I only saw once a year, neighbors, a handful of Diane's old church friends, plates of barbecue balanced carefully on knees, children running shrieking around the dock in wet swimsuits. I remember feeling almost genuinely peaceful that particular afternoon, sunscreen on my shoulders, which in hindsight feels like the universe's cruelest possible joke, because peaceful was the very last thing I would feel again for a very long time afterward. Ashley had been noticeably quieter than usual for weeks leading up to that day, and everyone in the family had simply assumed it meant she'd finally settled down a little, maybe even matured, whatever that particular word meant inside our family's specific vocabulary. She showed up to the cookout in a loose, flowing sundress, sat mostly in the shade near the tree line the entire afternoon, and I remember thinking, almost tenderly, that she looked genuinely tired, that maybe she was finally learning to take better care of herself after all these years. I had absolutely no idea in that moment that I was looking directly at a woman 6 weeks postpartum, twice over, standing roughly 20 feet away from the exact husband whose 2 children she had quietly delivered in secret. It was Diane's older sister, my great-aunt by marriage technically, who finally said it out loud, standing casually by the drink cooler with a paper plate of watermelon balanced in one hand. Completely unaware she was about to detonate my entire life in front of 40 witnesses at once. She squeezed my forearm affectionately and said, "Isn't it just something being an aunt twice over so suddenly like this? And God bless David for stepping up the way he has through all of it." I gave her the polite, automatic smile you learn early as the responsible one in any family and said, stepping up how exactly, genuinely confused, still thinking there might be some nephew from David's side of the family I simply hadn't met yet. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 full seconds, but I have relived those exact 3 seconds more times than I can honestly count since that day. I watched my great-aunt's expression shift from pleasant to visibly horrified in real time, mid-bite of watermelon, as she slowly realized I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. She looked past my shoulder toward the dock, and I turned instinctively to follow her eyes. And there was Ashley, sitting beside David near the water, his hand resting easily on the back of her folding chair in a way that suddenly, in that single frozen second, looked far less like ordinary family comfort and a great deal more like something else entirely. I want to be honest with you about what physically happened inside my own body in that exact moment, because I think it matters more than anything that was actually said out loud. My ears started ringing, a high, thin sound underneath all the party noise. My hands, holding a paper plate of coleslaw, went completely numb, and I remember thinking very clearly in this strange, calm, detached voice inside my own head, "Don't drop the plate, Megan. Whatever else happens right now, do not drop this plate in front of everyone watching." I did not cry, I did not scream or raise my voice even once. I set the plate down very gently on top of the cooler, and I asked my great-aunt quietly, almost politely, to please say all of that again, slower this time. In those 3 seconds before anyone said another word, my mind did something strange and involuntary, flipping backward through years of small evidence all at once like a deck of cards being shuffled too fast to read individually. The perfume on the couch cushions, the late nights that never matched the timesheets, the pause at that dinner table over a trip I didn't remember, David's phone always face down on the counter for the last 2 years. It wasn't one single thought so much as a wave of recognition crashing over everything I had quietly chosen not to see, and underneath the ringing in my ears there was a small, ugly, honest voice saying, of course it was them you always suspected, and you never let yourself finish the sentence." She did, stumbling badly through an apology that only made everything worse with every new word. Twins born 6 weeks earlier at the hospital downtown, and she'd assumed, everyone at that party had apparently assumed, that of course I already knew. Why on earth wouldn't the wife know something like that? I watched Ashley's face drain completely white across the yard as she realized exactly what was unfolding at the drink cooler, and I watched David lurch to his feet so fast his folding lawn chair tipped straight over backward into the grass. Nobody moved to help him right it. 40 people simply stood frozen where they were, watching me instead, waiting quietly to see what the responsible one would finally do with the truth, now that she actually had it. Here is the moment I think about most out of everything that happened that entire year, because it changed absolutely everything that came after it. I didn't scream, I didn't throw the plate or my drink or accuse a single person in front of the small children still running around the dock, oblivious. Something inside me, some old, exhausted, 20-year-old habit of quietly holding this family together at all costs, simply switched off in that instant like a breaker flipping cleanly in a fuse box I never even knew I had installed inside myself. I looked at David, then at Ashley, then, last of all, at Diane, standing very still by the grill with a spatula forgotten in her hand, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read yet, though I would come to understand it completely months later, in a very different room. I picked my purse up off the picnic table with a steadiness that surprised even me, said, very calmly to no one in particular, that I needed some air, and walked to my car without ever once raising my voice. David called my name twice across the yard, his voice cracking on the second try. I didn't turn around, not even slightly. I drove all 11 miles home on complete autopilot, hands perfectly steady on the wheel, my mind entirely blank in that particular, floating way. Real shock makes you blank, and it wasn't until I finally pulled into our own driveway, alone, engine still running, that the sound finally came out of me all at once. In the front seat of a car, I suddenly, absurdly, realized I might not even legally get to keep. Diane called me the very next morning after the cookout, before 9, her voice tight and careful in a way I'd never heard from her before, asking only if I was all right and whether I needed anything, without once mentioning what had actually happened at the lake house the day before. I told her I was fine, which was a lie we both clearly recognized in the silence that followed, and she said quietly, "Whatever you decide to do, Megan, you call me first. Not David, not Ashley, me." And I remember sitting on my bathroom floor after that call, trying to understand why those particular words felt like they carried more weight than a simple offer of comfort. I didn't sleep at all that night, or honestly, really any full night that entire following week. David came home nearly 4 hours after I did, reeking faintly of the guilt of a man who had spent the entire drive rehearsing an explanation in his head, and I let him talk for exactly as long as it took me to realize he wasn't going to say the actual word sorry without immediately qualifying it into something smaller. He said things happened, that he had never meant for it to go this far, that the timing of everything was complicated, as though timing itself was the injustice here, and not the two actual human beings his own sister-in-law had apparently given birth to in secret. I asked him exactly one question that night, sitting across from him at our kitchen table at nearly 2 in the morning, and I want to share it with you because I genuinely think it's the only honest question worth asking in a moment like that. I asked him how long, not why, not how could you possibly do this, just how long, because the length of a lie tells you almost everything you actually need to know about whether it was a mistake or an entire second life. He stared down at the floor for a long, heavy moment before he finally said 2 years. And something inside me went very cold and very clear all at once, the exact way water gets right before it turns fully to ice. 2 years meant that every single holiday dinner I had personally hosted during that window had secretly been a stage set for a performance I never once knew I was starring in against my will. 2 years meant that every time I quietly covered Ashley's lapsed car insurance or her rent shortfall, I might as well have been directly funding the very thing that was slowly destroying my own marriage from the inside out. I didn't say a single word of that out loud to David that particular night. I simply told him I needed him to sleep in the guest room from now on. And then I sat alone at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and for the first time in 9 full years, I opened our shared accounts not to manage the family's money on everyone else's behalf, but purely to protect my own future for once. If you've ever had to quietly become a detective inside your own home overnight, you already know exactly how strange that particular feeling is. Cross-referencing dates on old hospital emails against calendar entries you'd genuinely forgotten you still kept, credit card statements for a hotel 11 minutes from the office that I had always innocently assumed were simply client dinners running late. It isn't dramatic, not the way it looks in movies. It's quiet, methodical, genuinely heartbreaking work, done alone at 2 in the morning in old pajamas, printing out pages you never once wanted to have to read twice, let alone hand to a stranger in a suit. I called my coworker Jessica that same week, someone I'd worked alongside for 6 years but never once told anything truly personal, and I remember sitting in my car in the office parking lot on my lunch break, telling her the whole thing in one long breath, the hospital email, the cookout, the 2 years David finally admitted to. She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said quietly, "Megan, you have spent this entire time making sure everyone else's life worked. I think it's time you found out what your own life is actually worth on paper." And I sat there in the driver's seat crying for the first time since it all happened. Not from grief exactly, more from the strange relief of finally saying it out loud to someone who wasn't involved in any of it, Within a single week, I had an appointment scheduled with a divorce attorney named Rachel Donnelly, recommended to me by a coworker who had gone through her own difficult split 2 years earlier and said Rachel was exactly the kind of lawyer who didn't waste your time being dramatic for effect. She simply built quiet, airtight cases instead. I remember sitting in Rachel's office that first afternoon with an entire folder of bank statements, the original LLC operating agreement, our joint mortgage documents, and even our old prenuptial agreement, the one David's family attorney had drafted years earlier that I had barely glanced at on my own wedding day because I had trusted the people asking me to sign it without a second thought. Rachel read through every single page twice, slowly, methodically, the way people read contracts when they genuinely intend to use every last clause inside them if they have to. She told me something that afternoon that I have quietly repeated to myself almost every single day since. She said, "The goal here isn't to punish him, Megan. Punishment is expensive and it rarely ends up feeling nearly as good as people expect it to. The actual goal is to make absolutely sure you leave this marriage with everything that is legally, provably, unquestionably yours, and not one single cent less than that." That one sentence quietly rearranged something permanent inside my chest. I stopped thinking about revenge that exact day and started thinking seriously about documentation instead. If you're going through something even remotely similar right now, gathering old statements at midnight while everyone else sleeps, feeling like you're the only person taking any of this seriously, I want you to know tonight that instinct is not paranoia, it is preparation. And it matters infinitely more in the long run than anger ever will. Please consider subscribing if this story is helping you feel even a little less alone right now. It costs absolutely nothing, and it genuinely keeps channels like mine able to keep telling stories like this one instead of quietly disappearing. I promise you, the next part of this story is worth staying for all the way through. The external push that finally moved everything forward arrived about 10 days after the cookout, in the completely unexpected form of a voicemail I was never supposed to hear at all. David had left his phone sitting face up on the kitchen counter while he showered, and it buzzed loudly with an incoming message from Ashley that played automatically over the car's Bluetooth speaker, still connected from earlier that same morning. Her voice on the recording was tight and visibly scared, saying they needed to talk to his mother themselves first before Diane heard some other version of the story that made both of them look even worse than they already did to everyone else. That single overheard sentence told me two important things at once, sitting there frozen in my own driveway. It told me the affair itself wasn't just some private tragedy quietly contained to the three of us alone. It told me Ashley and David were already actively strategizing together about managing Diane's eventual reaction, which meant Diane's opinion clearly still mattered enormously to both of them, in a way mine apparently hadn't for at least 2 full years. And it told me something else I honestly hadn't fully considered until that exact second, that Diane herself didn't know the truth yet either, which meant whatever was coming next, whenever she finally did find out, was almost certainly not going to be gentle, quiet, or controllable by either one of them. In the weeks leading up to that conference, David tried twice to talk me out of using Rachel at all, showing up at my new apartment unannounced once with takeout from the restaurant where we'd had our first date, as though the memory of a plate of pasta could undo 2 years of a secret he'd kept from me while I hosted his mistress at my own dinner table. I let him say his piece both times, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, and both times I told him the same thing, that I wasn't interested in relitigating the marriage in my living room, that whatever needed to be said could be said through our attorneys, and both times he left looking more frustrated than the time before, as though my calm was somehow the injustice now. The settlement conference was finally scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late September, held in a conference room at David's family attorney's office instead of an actual courtroom, because Rachel had explained it would be faster and considerably cheaper for everyone if both sides could reasonably agree on terms without forcing a judge's crowded schedule into the mix. I walked in that morning with Rachel steady beside me, wearing the simple navy suit I'd bought specifically for that occasion, feeling far steadier than I honestly expected to feel, mostly because, for the first time in nearly 2 years, I actually knew more than everyone else sitting in that particular room. David sat directly across the polished table with his own attorney, a sharp-looking man named Robert, who kept sliding printed spreadsheets toward Rachel like he was dealing cards in some high-stakes game, only he fully understood the rules of. Their opening position that morning was almost insulting in its sheer confidence, that the duplex and the entire company were purely marital business assets, essentially David's family inheritance, and that I was entitled only to a modest cash settlement reflecting my, quote, administrative contributions over the years. As though 9 full years of meticulous bookkeeping had simply been a part-time hobby, they were now generously, magnanimously compensating me for. I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily at that exact phrase, administrative contributions. But I didn't say a single word out loud, because Rachel had already told me precisely what would happen next, and I trusted her completely by that point in the process. She slid one single manila folder calmly across the polished table, still unopened, and said there was one additional document neither side had formally entered into evidence yet. Something that had arrived directly from Diane Sullivan's own estate attorney only 2 days earlier at Diane's specific, deeply personal request, and she felt strongly that everyone in that room ought to see it before a single person signed anything at all. That was the exact moment the heavy conference room door opened, and Diane herself walked in, unannounced. Nobody had told me she would be there that morning. David's face went the pale color of printer paper almost instantly. Diane didn't sit down at the table right away. She stood quietly at the head of it instead, wearing the same gray blazer she wore to church every Sunday, holding her own personal copy of whatever was inside that folder, and she said, in a voice I had genuinely never once heard her use before, steady, almost sad, that she had something important to say before anyone in that room divided up a single thing that actually belonged to her own family. She told the entire room that 6 years earlier, after quietly watching Megan personally handle 2 separate serious financial crises inside the company that David had, in her own careful words, either directly caused or simply chosen to ignore, she had gone ahead and quietly amended the operating agreement of Sullivan Property Group and formally reassigned the controlling membership interest in the Myers Park duplex, not to her own son David, but to me through a properly notarized transfer that her estate attorney had filed and held privately, quietly, ever since, specifically because she had never fully trusted her own son with serious money, and had trusted me with it instead from nearly the very first year I had joined this family. I remember the exact physical weight of that folder when Rachel finally slid it toward me across the table so I could read it myself. The paper slightly heavier than ordinary printer paper, an official watermark I recognized from years of handling the company's own real estate filings. My hands were steady reading it, steadier than I expected because some part of me, some quiet accountant's instinct that had spent 9 years reading fine print for a living, understood before my emotions caught up that this single document had just rewritten every assumption everyone in that room had walked in with that morning, including my own. The entire room went completely, utterly silent. David actually laughed once, a short, disbelieving, almost panic sound, and said, "That's not even possible, Mom. That building is legally under the company. I'm the one who runs the company." Diane looked at him, then the exact way you look at a stubborn child insisting the sky is a different color than it plainly is, and said, gently, but without a single ounce of remaining doubt in her voice, "You run the office, David. Megan has quietly run everything that actually matters in this family for 6 full years. And I simply made sure the paperwork finally formally said what had already been true the entire time." David kept insisting, voice rising slightly for the first time that morning, that his mother had to be confused, that she'd probably signed something years ago without fully understanding what her own estate attorney had drafted, an old woman being taken advantage of by lawyers. His words, not mine. Diane didn't raise her voice back at him even once. She simply said, "I have never once in my life signed a document I didn't fully understand, David, and I would ask you not to start telling people I have." Not today, not in front of Megan, not after everything, and something in the flat certainty of her tone finally seemed to land on him in a way nothing else that morning had. Robert, David's own attorney, grabbed for the folder and started scanning through it rapidly, his confident posture from 20 minutes earlier completely visibly gone now. I watched his eyes move steadily down the page, watched him find the notarized signature block, the official recording stamp from the County Register of Deeds, the date stamped clearly 6 years old, long predating any divorce filing by years, which meant there was absolutely no argument left to make that this was some convenient last-minute maneuver engineered on my part. It was simply, quietly true, and it had been true for 6 entire years, waiting patiently in a locked filing cabinet for exactly this single moment to matter. Rachel didn't gloat even slightly. She never did. She simply calmly stated for the official record that given this new documentation, the duplex and its associated LLC interest were legally Megan's separate property, not a marital asset subject to any division at all, which meant the entire foundation of David's opening position had just quietly evaporated in front of every single person in that room. I watched Ashley, who had been sitting quietly out in the hallway, waiting to be called in for her own separate, unrelated conversation about paternity arrangements, glance through the open door and understand immediately from all our frozen faces that whatever she had been secretly hoping to gain from this entire ordeal had just gone with it, permanently. I noticed in that stretched-out silence right after Diane finished speaking that nobody in that conference room actually looked at David anymore, not Robert, not the paralegal quietly taking notes near the door, not even Rachel, who kept her attention politely fixed on the document in front of her. Every single person's attention had simply, quietly redirected itself toward Diane and me, as though the room itself understood, faster than the two men still trying to argue about it, that the real story here had never actually been about David at all. It had been about two women who'd been paying far closer attention than anyone gave either of us credit for. Diane looked directly at me then, not at David, not at Robert, and said the one thing that actually mattered to me out of everything said in that entire room that day. She said, "I'm sorry I never once told you why I trusted you with all of it. I never knew how to properly explain that I'd seen something troubling in my own son a long time before you ever did. And I didn't want to poison your marriage with my own private suspicion. I only wanted to make absolutely sure that whatever eventually happened, you would never once leave this family with nothing because you were the only person who ever actually built anything real here." I didn't cry in that conference room, though I came genuinely close twice. I simply nodded, said thank you quietly, and reached over to put my hand on top of Diane's for a long moment, the two of us sitting together in the quiet wreckage of a marriage that had somehow ended with her, of all people, standing firmly beside me instead of beside her own son. David didn't say another word for the rest of that meeting. I honestly don't think he had anything left to say that would have changed a single line of the paperwork now sitting open on the table between all of us. If you've ever watched a quiet person get handed back their own worth in front of the very people who overlooked them for years, you already know there's no dramatic, swelling music playing in real life, just a strange, heavy stillness settling over the room. And underneath that stillness, something that finally, quietly feels like relief after a very long time without it. If this part of my story is landing with you tonight, this is exactly the moment I'd gently ask you to hit that subscribe button, because what happened next is honestly the part that changed my life the most. Not the courtroom drama itself, but the quiet, deliberate rebuilding that came directly after it. The divorce was finalized 11 full weeks later, faster than Rachel had originally predicted, mostly because once the duplex was permanently off the table as a contested asset, David and Robert both lost most of their appetite for a long, drawn-out fight over what remained. I walked away with the Myers Park duplex fully, legally in my own name, roughly $3 million in real estate generating steady, reliable monthly income, my retirement accounts completely untouched, and a car that was fully paid off and, legally, finally, only mine to keep. David kept the day-to-day operations of Sullivan Property Group's smaller, less valuable rental properties, which, without the duplex's steady income anchoring the overall books, turned out to be a far less impressive business than anyone had genuinely let him believe it was for 9 straight years. I heard secondhand, through mutual friends, months later, that he'd actually had to take out a small business loan just to cover one slow quarter, something the company had genuinely never once needed while I was the one quietly balancing its books every month. I felt no real satisfaction hearing that news, honestly, only a quiet, settled kind of confirmation I'd already expected. Ashley moved 2 full states away with the twins about 4 months after that settlement conference, closer to her own mother's side of the family, and I understand from a cousin who still talks to both of us occasionally that she and David now see the children on a formal schedule, arranged through actual family lawyers, nothing at all like the easy, constant, unquestioned access she used to have to my own dinner table for years on end. I don't wish those 2 children anything but a genuinely good life ahead of them. They never chose any part of this. I made my peace with that particular fact fairly early on, honestly, faster than I expected to. I remember the first Christmas after everything settled, spent quietly at Diane's house with just the 2 of us, a small turkey breast instead of the enormous spread she used to cook for 20 people, and how strange it felt to sit at that same dining table without David or Ashley anywhere in the room, and how, underneath the strangeness, there was also something close to comfort. 2 women who had both been quietly underestimated by the same man, finally just eating dinner together without any secrets left between us at all. Diane and I still talk every single week, usually on quiet Sunday afternoons, the exact same time slot family dinner used to occupy for years. Except now it's simply the 2 of us, or sometimes her and me and a shared bottle of wine out on her porch overlooking Lake Norman as the sun goes down. She told me once, months after everything had finally settled, that watching me handle myself in that conference room the way I did was the proudest she had ever felt of anyone in her entire family, including, she admitted quietly, her own son. I've genuinely come to think of her less as my former mother-in-law now, and more as the mother who actually deliberately chose me. I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store about a year after the divorce, someone who'd been at that 4th of July cookout and had watched the entire thing unfold from a few feet away. And she squeezed my hand in the cereal aisle and said she thought about that day often, about how quietly I'd walked to my car instead of making a scene, and how much she'd admired it, even though, in her words, she wouldn't have blamed me one bit for screaming the whole yard down. I told her the truth, that I hadn't felt brave in that moment at all, only numb, and that the bravery, if there was any, came later in Rachel's office at 2 in the morning with a laptop open, not in Diane's backyard with 40 people watching. I set a firm boundary with Ashley the following spring when she reached out unexpectedly asking to meet for coffee to, in her own words, clear the air between the 2 of us. I told her, calmly and without any real anger left in my voice, that I didn't need the air cleared at all. I needed genuine distance instead, and that I wished her well raising her 2 children, but that our relationship as sisters simply wasn't something I was interested in rebuilding right now, or honestly, possibly ever again. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was simply true, and saying it out loud finally felt like setting down a heavy bag I had been quietly carrying since I was 12 years old. About 8 months after the divorce, I started my own small bookkeeping practice out of a rented office downtown, taking on a handful of local business clients who wanted exactly the kind of careful, honest attention I had given the Sullivan family for 9 years, without ever once being paid what it was actually worth. Within the first year, I was earning almost double my old $54,000 salary on my own terms with my own name on the door, and the first time I saw my own name printed on a business license, I sat in my car outside the county office for a full 10 minutes just looking at it, feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. I moved into a smaller house near downtown Charlotte that first winter afterward. Just me, close enough to my new office that I could actually walk there some mornings if the weather cooperated, and I remember standing alone in the empty living room the day I finally got the keys. No furniture yet, just afternoon light, spilling in through bare windows, feeling something I honestly hadn't felt in longer than I could clearly remember, which was simply quiet. Not the loaded, watchful, careful quiet of my old marriage. Just ordinary, peaceful, entirely mine. Some nights, even now, I still find myself doing the old math out of habit, the way you'd probe a healed injury just to check it still hurts, running the numbers on what my life would have looked like if that hospital email had never landed in my inbox, if David and Ashley had simply managed to keep their secret quiet for another decade. If Diane had never quietly walked into that estate attorney's office 6 years earlier to sign a document nobody asked her to sign, I always land in the same place. I would have kept paying, kept balancing, kept smiling politely at family dinners, slowly disappearing inside a life that was never actually built to hold me as anything more than useful. I still personally do the books for the Myers Park duplex actually, because Diane specifically asked me to keep managing it, and because I'm genuinely good at it, and because it's mine now completely, both on paper and in every other way that actually matters. Every single month, when I file the rent roll, I think briefly and quietly about how close I once came to spending the rest of my life managing an asset that would never once have been legally recognized as even partly my own. If one determined woman hadn't quietly decided years before any of this ever happened that I deserved something far better than what her own son was ever likely to give me, if there's one thing I genuinely want you to take away from my story tonight, let it be this: being the responsible one in your family is not a life sentence you have to serve forever, and it is definitely not an acceptable substitute for being told the honest truth by the people who claim to love you the most. You are allowed to keep the books, keep the peace, keep the entire family quietly running smoothly, and still ask, quietly but firmly, what exactly you're being trusted with all that responsibility in exchange for. I didn't have to destroy a single thing to get my own life back, and I think that particular detail genuinely surprises people whenever I tell this story out loud. I didn't burn one bridge that didn't already have a fire quietly smoldering underneath it long before I ever arrived on the scene. I simply stopped quietly funding a life that was never fully mine to begin with. And I let the truth, once it finally arrived on its own schedule, do the heavy lifting I had been doing entirely by myself for far too many years. If you've ever felt genuinely invisible to the very people you protect the most, I hope tonight reminds you that being consistently overlooked is not remotely the same thing as being unworthy, and that sometimes the people who actually see you most clearly aren't the ones you would have expected at all. They're the ones who were quietly paying close attention the entire time, patiently waiting for exactly the right moment to hand you back everything that was always supposed to be yours in the first place. Thank you so much for listening to my story all the way to the end tonight. It genuinely means more to me than you probably realize. If it moved you even a little bit, please consider subscribing. It's completely free, and it truly helps me keep sharing stories like this one with people out there who need to hear them most. And if you personally know someone who's always the responsible one in their own family, the one who quietly holds everything together and never once gets asked how they're really doing underneath it all, maybe send this story their way tonight. They might need it more than they'll ever admit out loud.